Man, this 5-on-5 in Saudi Arabia is something else. What's good? It's Woog. We've got Filip Hrgovic, 17 wins and 0 losses, taking on Daniel DuBois, 20 wins and 2 losses. This fight is a part of a card that continues the incredible run that Turkey Al-Sheikh and Saudi Arabia have been on over the past several months. And what's interesting about this card is that it features a 5-on-5 lineup where it's 5 Queensberry Promotions fighters, that's Frank Warren, taking on Eddie Hearn's 5 Matchroom fighters. And there are a couple wild cards where one promoter could pick somebody who's not necessarily in their stable, but the spirit of this card is Queensberry versus Matchroom. And this was initially supposed to be headlined by the long-awaited Battle for Undisputed at light heavyweight with Artur Beterbiev versus Dmitry Bivol, one of the best fights that could be made in all of boxing. But Beterbiev got injured, as he often does leading up to the fight, so they're gonna unfortunately have to postpone that one, but they're keeping the rest of the card, and Dmitry Bivol's also gonna be on the card, but he will be fighting more of a tune-up fight. So one of the most interesting fights on this card, in my opinion, is this Filip Hrgovic versus Daniel DuBois matchup. And if you look at the betting odds, Hrgovic is a greater than 2-to-1 favorite over DuBois. Now, Filip Hrgovic, he's a former Olympic bronze medalist, and he's got this reputation because he has such a deep amateur pedigree. A lot of people think that he is basically a champion in waiting. He has, for a few fights now, been the IBF mandatory for Alexander Usyk, who is now the undisputed champion. But at the time, he was first tied up with that rematch against Anthony Joshua. In fact, Hrgovic fought Zhilei Zhang on the Usyk versus AJ2 undercard, and then Usyk had to fulfill his WBA mandatory, and that was against Daniel DuBois. Usyk won that fight, and then he fought the Battle for Undisputed against Tyson Fury. But to fight that fight and for it to be for all of the titles, they had to ask the IBF to basically give their blessing and to not strip Usyk of the IBF belt and to let that Battle for Undisputed happen, which the IBF did. And now they're kind of in a weird spot where they haven't yet stripped Usyk, and some people thought that maybe Hrgovic versus DuBois would be for the actual IBF belt, but maybe they're going to give Usyk some time to decide on what he's going to do next, if he's going to fulfill his IBF mandatory obligation. I think Usyk and his team asked the IBF for like another exemption so they could run it back with Fury and have that rematch be for all the belts. So we'll see how all of that plays out. But as it stands, Hrgovic has been waiting for his IBF shot. And for a while, I thought that he was going to kind of hold out and just kind of bide his time until he got his opportunity, especially after he won that super close, somewhat controversial fight against Zhilei Zhang. Like, that was the first major step up for Hrgovic. Like, before that, he was fighting the likes of Rydell Booker, Eric Molina, just kind of old veterans. He fought Kevin Johnson too, and he was more or less just running over a lot of these guys. That was not the case when he fought Zhilei Zhang. In fact, Zhang knocked him down in the first round with not even a left hand. Usually Zhilei Zhang likes to let that left fly, but he actually caught Hrgovic coming in with a check right hook. Very sneaky punch for Zhilei Zhang. In fact, I mentioned that punch a lot in my recent Wilder versus Zhilei Zhang breakdown. But yeah, Filip Hrgovic was more voluminous. He was throwing more punches than Zhang, but Zhang was having the bigger moments in backing Hrgovic up and hurting Hrgovic. But minute for minute, there were a lot of points in the fight where Hrgovic was throwing more punches, throwing more combinations, and was just doing more during the slower, less explosive periods of the fight. And this was a grueling fight. This went, the full 12. Zhilei Zhang was very tired by the end of this, as Zhilei Zhang often looks pretty spent in the later rounds. But Filip Hrgovic didn't look like he was having a great time in there either. And they had like a clash of heads in the early rounds, which caused a cut to the head, to like the top of Hrgovic's head. This was a really tough fight that had several rounds that were pretty tough to score. So you had, very differing opinions on who won this fight, but as it stood, Hrgovic won via unanimous decision, which again, as I was watching that fight, it was just a little bit of a head scratcher, no pun intended, with Hrgovic's cut to the head. But when I was watching it, I thought that Zhilei Zhang did enough to kind of edge the fight by like a round, and if it was going to be even, then that knockdown for Zhilei Zhang should have been the difference. I saw the fight kind of close, but edging it towards Zhang. Hrgovic won a unanimous decision, and then he had 2 kind of meaningless, stay busy fights. One against Dempsey McKean and then one against Mark DeMori. I mean, that Mark DeMori one was a major mismatch. Like the Dempsey McKean one, Dempsey McKean was kind of on a come up. He's been a lot of very good fighters, sparring partners. When they were talking about who AJ might fight around the time that he fought Jermaine Franklin, Dempsey McKean was one of the names that Eddie Hearn threw out there as a possible opponent for Anthony Joshua. Dempsey McKean is a southpaw as well, but Filip Hrgovic was winning pretty much all the rounds, but he wasn't looking spectacular when he was doing it. And there's something about Hrgovic's body language that, I don't know, it just bothers me. It just looks a little bit listless. Now, he's obviously doing work in there. I mean, he's fighting and he's usually winning, all the fights that he's involved in, but he's got this demeanor, this posture, this look as he's walking back to his corners like, oh God, here we go again. It just doesn't look very high spirited. Now that might just be in contrast to what he's actually doing in there. Like he might actually feel more spirited than his body language sometimes implies, but I don't know. Like, I mean, if I was judging a fight, I can't say that would totally be a non-factor in how I'm scoring certain rounds, because if you look like you're having like a hell of a time and you don't want to be there, I don't know, it could give somebody the impression that somebody else is impacting you in a way that perhaps they are not. So Hrgovic has this reputation of kind of being a boogeyman for a while. Before, Zhilei Zhang fought him, they were kind of going down the list. I think, Joseph Parker was one of the guys who was offered this, IBF mandatory status eliminator fight with Hrgovic, and I think it was Joseph Parker, and correct me if I'm wrong if you've got the names, but another one of those fighters I believe was Michael Hunter. They went down the list for a few fighters and nobody was interested. Not that they were ducking Filip Hrgovic, maybe they didn't see it as being worth it, fighting this very risky, very good fighter for a chance to maybe have a shot at the title. Because just because you are in a mandatory or #1 contender position doesn't always mean that you get first dibs, evidently, right? Hrgovic, even after fighting Zhilei Zhang, who was the guy who raised his hands and stepped up and said, I'll fight Hrgovic. I mean, 2 fights later, Filip Hrgovic is still looking for his title shot. And now he's going to be taking on Daniel Dubois. This is way better than his last couple of opponents. Zhilei Zhang is the only guy in the ballpark of Daniel Dubois. Now, most people would probably rate Zhilei Zhang higher than Dubois, and that's because of Dubois' 2 losses and the way that he lost. So Daniel Dubois was looking like a knockout artist early in his career, right? For his first 15 fights. In fact, 14 out of his first 15 fights resulted in knockout wins. So he's one of these guys who has a super high KO percentage. And then he fought Joe Joyce. And some might not remember, but Daniel Dubois was a sizable favorite against Joe Joyce. He was supposed to win that fight because of how impressive he was looking against a lot of this lesser competition. Kevin Johnson, who I had mentioned as being a common opponent for Dubois and for Hrgovic. So Kevin Johnson, Nathan Gorman, Razvan Kojanu, fighters like that, or at least of that caliber. So then Daniel Dubois fights Joe Joyce. And Joe Joyce, we knew that he was showing these traits of being seemingly indestructible, but we hadn't seen him do it against anybody the caliber of Daniel Dubois. Like, this is well before Joe Joyce knocked Joseph Parker out, and this is obviously before Joe Joyce lost those back-to-back knockout and stoppage fights against Zhilei Zhang. This is before that. So Joe Joyce was the underdog against Daniel Dubois. Joe Joyce just kept on marching forward. He was eating whatever shots Daniel Dubois was delivering, but he was getting his jabs out there and his straight rights out there. And he started to kind of pepper, or maybe pepper's not the word. Pepper, you would think somewhat inconsequential. I guess bludgeon might be more appropriate, but he was tagging Daniel Dubois with that jab to the point where in the 10th round, Daniel Dubois, I mean, the tide was already turning and it looked like Joe Joyce was doing the better work. He was winning the majority of the rounds, but it was a competitive fight. Daniel Dubois was right in it, but he started to get hit more and more with that jab and some of those right hands. Joe Joyce, kind of a clumsy style, but it was working, very effective and very discouraging for Daniel Dubois, whose power usually gets him out of it. You know what I mean? But again, he started getting tagged. He ended up taking a knee and he didn't respond to the 10 count. He let the ref count to 10. That was that. it turned out to be a bit of an eye injury. I don't know what kind of a retina, or I don't know the severity of the eye injury, but that was why he took the knee and decided not to continue. So this went down as a knockout win for Joe Joyce. So at that point, a lot of people are sour on Daniel Dubois, kind of calling him a quitter, questioning his heart and so forth. So Daniel Dubois then wins his next few fights, Bogdanino and Kusumano, the last guy who I think, well, not the last guy, but the second to last guy, I think that stopped Konachki and then tested positive for PEDs. Daniel Dubois knocked him out in the first round. And then he fights Trevor Bryan for the regular WBA belt, that Trevor Bryan was somehow holding on to for like a while. Daniel Dubois stopped Trevor Bryan in the fourth round. He just put a quick beating and made quick work of Trevor Bryan. And that was pretty impressive. Like, I didn't look at Trevor Bryan as being a bad fighter. I just didn't think he should be associated with the name champion, heavyweight champion, you know what I mean? And so Daniel Dubois looked pretty impressive. That was like on a Don King card. So then Daniel Dubois fights Kevin Lerena next. And this was on the Tyson Fury versus, I want to say, Derek Chisora 3 undercard. And Kevin Lerena somehow drops Daniel Dubois like 3 times, but it didn't look like it was a result of Daniel Dubois getting hit by something and therefore succumbing to the punch and getting knocked down. It wasn't like Daniel Dubois had some sort of a chin issue. It looked like he was having some sort of a leg issue, which I guess turned out to be a knee issue. So Daniel Dubois just looked like he couldn't get his legs under him, and he was just kind of falling down sort of awkwardly. And again, it was from punches that didn't look like they should have been knocking Daniel Dubois down. So Daniel Dubois gets dropped a couple times early. It's really puzzling. It's like, oh my God, what's going on here? And then Daniel Dubois, like in the second and then the third round, starts putting a beating on Kevin Lerena, a former cruiserweight. He ends up knocking Kevin Lerena out in the third round. So again, power wins the day. Power won the day against Trevor Bryan. Power won the day against Bogdanino. Most of Daniel Dubois' opponents get knocked out. I mean, again, at this point, it was just Joe Joyce and his indestructible nature that was able to withstand Daniel Dubois' onslaught. So then Daniel Dubois gets a title shot against Alexander Usyk, and Usyk is winning the early rounds, but you see Daniel Dubois start to do good work to the body. And even before the controversial punch to Usyk's belt line that dropped Usyk and had Usyk on his side, in pain for some time, even before that, and even after that, you saw some of those punches that were hitting around Usyk's belly area. Usyk was looking at the ref like, hey, you're gonna let this continue? When they didn't appear to be illegal punches. Some of these punches looked like they were clean shots, but Usyk, again, and you saw him do this with Fury as well. Fury was hitting Usyk to the body, and with a few of those shots, Usyk was looking at the ref like, hey, you're gonna step in and do something about that? I don't know if that's like a head game that he plays with his opponent. I don't know if he really thinks that the shot is low. I don't know if the shot just badly hurts and it's borderline low, so he's reacting in that way to it. I don't know what is up with that, but one of those Dubois shots to Usyk's belt line dropped Usyk, and Usyk was given several minutes to recover. The public and even the major journalists, former fighters, trainers, people seem to be split on whether this was a legal blow or an illegal blow. I feel like slightly more people thought that it was a legal shot. Let me know if you read the room differently, but that's kind of how I gauged that. I think I even threw out a YouTube poll asking, and I think that more than 50% thought that it was a legal blow. But a lot of people also thought that, if it was a legal blow, then Daniel Dubois should be heavyweight champion. I'm like, not so fast. I'm like, Usyk knew that he was given time. The ref ruled it a low blow. I think that if Usyk got dropped by that punch and the ref was in his face counting 4, 5, Usyk would have found the gusto to get back up. That's just my belief. I don't think that Usyk would have just been writhing in pain, like a little like Oscar De La Hoya when he got hit by Bernard Hopkins with that punch that ended the fight. Oscar looked like he didn't care if you counted to 30. He wasn't getting up. Usyk did look like that, but I think that he would have gotten up if the ref started counting. But yeah, Daniel Dubois did good work to Usyk's body, but when Usyk got up from that one, yes, there were a couple more good shots that landed to Usyk's body around the belt line area, and yes, Usyk did react in that strange way to them, but for the most part, throughout this fight, Usyk was outboxing Daniel Dubois, just tagging him and hitting him with combinations, hitting him with that straight left, hitting him with that lead probing right hand. And Daniel Dubois was just kind of getting pieced up. And over time, you saw Daniel Dubois, his volume decrease. He wasn't really going for it anymore, wasn't really selling out on his punches. And it seemed like it was only a matter of time. He got dropped in the 8th round. But again, this wasn't a drop where it was punch, boom, boom, you hit the canvas. Nothing like that. It was, okay, I think I'm done taking punches for right now. Let me take this knee. Daniel Dubois did that, and he got up, and then in the next round, he did it again, got hit, hit some more, took another knee, and this time he just took the whole 10 count. So that was twice that Daniel Dubois lost by taking a knee and letting the ref count to 10. So that by this point, people are like, oh my God, what is up with this dude? Now, he took a beating against Usyk, and who am I to say that eye issue, getting hit by somebody who pummels people like Joe Joyce does, who am I to call Daniel Dubois a quitter? But I think that the idea was that he's got a threshold that he's willing to fight through, and then he's got a line that he draws, and he's like, okay, I give it a good shot, and enough is enough. I think we could call it a day. Then Daniel Dubois fights Jarrell Big Baby Miller, who came into that fight like 300 pounds. Jarrell Miller, the very charismatic PED cheater, notoriously, tested positive before a scheduled fight against Anthony Joshua in Madison Square Garden. Jarrell Miller lost several years of his career, tested positive a couple times after that positive test. So he comes in overweight against Daniel Dubois. People are wondering, is Jarrell Miller, who's a high volume puncher, who comes forward, puts a lot of pressure on his opponents, is he going to be able to break Daniel Dubois in the way that Usyk and Joe Joyce did? This was actually a very redemptive performance for Daniel Dubois. He not only withstood the pressure, but he outboxed Jarrell Miller, beat him up. Jarrell Miller slowed down big time around the 5th or 6th round. It was all Daniel Dubois after that, and Daniel Dubois ended up stopping Jarrell Miller in the 10th round. It was pretty dramatic, and I felt happy for Daniel Dubois because of all the trash that I'm sure he's had to hear over the past couple of years, pretty much ever since that Joe Joyce fight. Now, as I'm looking at Hrgovic versus Daniel Dubois, I ain't gonna lie, I do have in the back of my mind, well, is Daniel Dubois gonna take another knee at some point here? Because, even before Daniel Dubois lost to Usyk or even to Joe Joyce, I had an impression of Daniel Dubois that he seemed like the type, just temperament-wise, who, maybe back in school, middle school, high school, that he was a type who was a big dude, a big, very physically able dude who would get punked by people half of his size. That's just temperament-wise, again, what Daniel Dubois struck me as. But to date, the only two fighters who've been able to kind of pull the quit out of Daniel Dubois have been Joe Joyce and Alexander Usyk. So I think that is because of the way that he lost to them. That's why he's a greater than 2-1 underdog against Filip Hrgovic. So look, I think Hrgovic, yes, he is the more classically trained boxer. Yes, he's got the deeper amateur pedigree. He's got a slight reach advantage, a 1-inch height advantage, and a few inch reach advantage, something like 82 to 78 inches. And yes, we did see Hrgovic get a narrow, very narrow win against Zhilei Zhang. But to me, I still think the jury's out on who Filip Hrgovic really is. I know that he's good. The question is how good. And he did get dropped against Zhang early. He did fight through it. He did win a lot of those rounds. So I don't question his heart. But you just don't know about a guy until you see him really tested against different styles of fighters. And again, to his credit, he made it the full distance and won the fight against Zhilei Zhang. So although Hrgovic he's got the reputation of being the more technically sound boxer, he does throw some interesting punches. He throws, straight shots, and he also throws looping shots. He'll mix it up. He'll throw nice uppercuts. He's trained by Ronnie Shields, Jamal Charlo's longtime trainer. There's a lot that I like about Filip Hrgovic, and he's getting, again, very good schooling. But Daniel Dubois, he might be the quickest fighter that Filip Hrgovic has fought. And I think that Daniel Dubois might have quicker hands than Filip Hrgovic. So Hrgovic is going to have to account for that. Daniel Dubois, I think, is a harder puncher between the two. Now, Filip Hrgovic knocks most of his opponents out. 14 out of his 17 wins have come via knockout. But I think per one punch, Daniel Dubois packs more of a punch. So Filip Hrgovic might be dealing with a guy who's quicker and a harder hitter. And so the way I look at this is, If Daniel Dubois fights this in a high-spirited way, like he really thinks that he could take this guy out, and he's not worried about his cardio, and he's relatively well-conditioned. So if he goes for broke in different spots, sells out on his punches, doesn't try to tit for tat the guy, and doesn't become discouraged to the point where he starts fighting more of a survivalist fight, if Daniel Dubois fights a mean, nasty fight and wants to and thinks he can take this guy out, I think Daniel Dubois got the goods to pull off the upset here. I think Daniel Dubois can hurt Hrgovic, can drop and even stop Hrgovic. But I get the impression that even if Daniel Dubois does buzz or hurt Hrgovic, which I kind of think that we might have a moment where Dubois drops Hrgovic, I think that Daniel Dubois is going to have some fireworks moments in this fight. I think that Hrgovic will work through it somehow. I think he's going to get out of the scary rounds. I think he's going to come back out and hit Daniel Dubois with shots that Dubois doesn't really see. I think he's going to hit him with some looping shots, some scooping shots, maybe some uppercuts. I think he's going to mix up his attack as he often does. Now, again, remember what I was saying about the body language. It's going to be interesting if Daniel Dubois fights a spirited fight and it's coupled with Hrgovic looking how he looks sometimes when he's walking back to the corner in a certain way. But I think that it's just more likely that Hrgovic, wins some of the close rounds. And I think that these will be competitive because, again, Hrgovic is going to have to account for not having the quicker hands in this fight. He's really going to have to be technical. He's going to have to be a little bit ruthless. He's going to have to take some chances. And I think that in taking some of those chances, he will get hurt by Daniel Dubois. But again, I still think that he's going to bounce back. I don't know if this fight starts going downhill for Daniel Dubois and Hrgovic starts building momentum, building steam. I don't know that Daniel Dubois doesn't get broken down and take another knee at some point. I think that Daniel Dubois is going to have his big moments. I think he is going to fight with a good amount of heart to where even when he starts getting blasted, it looks like, uh-oh, is he going to quit again? If it goes there, I think Daniel Dubois is going to fight through that. But I'm going to go with Filip Hrgovic to pull off a decision win. I think that there might be some swing rounds here. I think that Daniel Dubois will win a couple of rounds, even outside of the round that if he drops Hrgovic. I think that there will be other rounds that he wins as well. I just think that Filip Hrgovic is going to be the busier fighter with more volume. And I think that at a point, Daniel Dubois is going to start throwing less, start conserving his energy, start acting like he's a little bit nervous of getting too tired and exhausted, and that he will eventually succumb, not take a knee totally, but he will succumb to losing a decision on the cards against Filip Hrgovic. So yeah, I'm taking Hrgovic via, I will say unanimous, but competitive, but unanimous decision for Filip Hrgovic. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on Hrgovic versus Dubois. Do you think that the odds should be as they are with Hrgovic a greater than 2-1 favorite? Who do you see winning this one and how? And how do you think that this IBF situation is going to shape up? Will Hrgovic's next fight be for the IBF title, or will he have to wait a little bit longer even after beating Daniel Dubois? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.